Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Ha'ay rab tawab la'atham za'achekam yawam manor Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kaya hamalakath hashamayim kwara. Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call layam la la banawa Yahweh bahasham Yahweh shai bahasham rocha kodash wa mashana laza kwanim nawa wa malaakim shorachakado, which is our praises to our Father Yahweh, which means He exists. Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, He delivers. And double honors to the elders and apostles of our great millstone, Zaban Sirach. This is Ecclesiasticus chapter 2, and we'll get verse 1. And it says, My son, if thou come to serve the Lord, prepare thy soul for temptation. Set thy heart aright, and constantly endure, and make not haste in time of trouble. All right. So let's get a quick precept. This is Mashal Yah, Proverbs chapter 8 and verse 1. It says, Doeth not wisdom cry, and understanding put forth her voice. It says, She standeth in the top of high places, by the way in the places of the paths. She crieth at the gates, at the entry of the city, at the coming in at the doors, because ultimately, this wisdom is essentially crying out. The word is readily accessible. All right, on the highways and byways, our elders and apostles, have been out on the highways and byways, for going on 40 plus years, so that essentially represents how, the wisdom is ultimately going forth, all right, in the chief places of concourse. So it says, verse 4, it says, Unto you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of man, all right, in which, the Lord deals with, women to a certain degree, all right, but the Lord ultimately, deals with the man, all right, and that's essentially the order that the Lord set up, all right. So going back to Bonsarat chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, My son, if thou come to serve the Lord, prepare thy soul for temptation, because ultimately, we are ultimately being tested, we're being tried, all right, because, the elect is likened unto, the precious metals, all right, specifically, the gold and the silver, all right, and ultimately, when the elect is likened unto, the souls of the elect is likened unto that gold and silver. That gold and silver has to go through a trying process, so ultimately the elect is going through a trying process in which the Lord is ultimately putting us through, different obstacles and tests, to see if to see how we're going to ultimately stand up against those different obstacles, because ultimately the elect is going to make it out on the other side, Verse 2, it says, Set thy heart aright and constantly endure, and make not haste in time of trouble. All right, so how we set our heart aright. I'm gonna get a quick precept. This is we'll get Thahar Yam Psalm chapter 1, and we'll get verse 1. It says, Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor sitteth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doeth he meditate day and night. All right, in which, blessed is ultimately going to be the man that is walking, that's not walking in the ways of the ungodly. Blessed is going to be the man that walks in righteousness. You see, because those that walk in righteousness will be rewarded, all right, for the righteousness that they are essentially conducting themselves in. All right, verse 2, it says, But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doeth he meditate day and night. All right, and what that ultimately is a picture of is stability. All right, so going back to Bonsarat 2 and verse 2, it says, Set thy heart aright, so ultimately when it says set thy heart aright, it means for us to stabilize ourselves, with this truth, because ultimately by standing in the scriptures, it allows forth for us to be stable. It allows forth to us to be rooted. Let's get this real fast. Zayashaya, this is Isaiah chapter 33, and we'll give verse 6, and it says, And wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of thy times, and strength of salvation. The fear of the Lord is his treasure. So the wisdom and knowledge of the scriptures is the stability, of the times that we in, and the times of Jacob's trouble. You see, while, the rest of the world is essentially being shaken up and moved, we're going to be stable. We're going to go through different things, but going back to Bonsarat chapter 2, it says, Set thy heart aright. All right, how we set our heart aright by having something stable and set. Essentially, that's a picture, again, of a stabilization. All right, let's get this word for stability. It says, Amawana. All right, and it says firmness, fidelity, steadfastness, steadiness. It says security, morally, fidelity. It says faithful. All right, which ultimately goes back to our faith, that we have been blessed to have, So ultimately, we are able to continue to be rooted and to be stabilized, about being rejuvenated via the scriptures. All right. Ultimately, the scriptures is how we essentially rejuvenate and renew ourselves. All right, because we have the belief on the scriptures. That's essentially how we set our heart aright, which that word for heart goes into the mind. All right, so the mind in Hebrew is lab. All right, and ultimately we set our minds aright by being stable, by essentially meditating upon the scriptures, daily. All right, because that's what our belief is the driving force to the fear, and the fear is ultimately what corresponds with that faith, to keep our minds focused. That's why the scriptures say, I'm gonna get this real fast. This is Matthew chapter 6, and we'll get verse 22, and it says, the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be, if therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. All right. So ultimately, if we have, our eyes focused, if we're focused, all right, it's a saying. It can go something like this in the world, but pretty much, where your eyes go, that's where the rest of the body gonna go. All right. And which you got your eyes on, that's what you got your intents on. You see, so if our eyes is focused on the Lord Yahweh Shai, essentially, that's where our mind is going to be at, and it's essentially how we set our heart right, because the Lord Yahweh Shai is ultimately, the trailblazer, and so he already has the way is already paved. We just have to follow. Essentially, what we're following, we are following the leader. All right. So going back, it says, "Set thy heart aright, and constantly endure." And make not haste in time of trouble. So we shouldn't be in the mindset of, when we're put into different situations, into different obstacles, to be so quick, or be in the mindset of being quick to get up out of the situation to where we're doing something irrational. We should be in the spirit of ultimately praying and seeing what it is that the Lord wants us to see, because the Lord ultimately puts us again through those different obstacles to grow us. All right. So it says, set thy heart aright, by buckling down in these scriptures, and constantly endure, and make not haste in time of trouble, because ultimately we have to go through that process, so that we can be those good pieces of precious metal. All right. So it says, cleave unto him and depart not away, that thou mayest be increased at thy last end, because we're cleaving unto the Lord, so that ultimately we can, so that we can endure, so that we can be in a state of living, you see, because if one was to depart, from the scriptures, then ultimately, they will be destroyed, in the end. All right, it says, Sirach 2:3, it says, cleave unto him and depart not away, that thou mayest be increased at thy last end. Let's get a quick precept. This is Dabaryam, Deuteronomy chapter 4, and we'll get verse 4. All right, because this is ultimately how we cleave. This is Deuteronomy Dabaryam chapter 4 and verse 4. It says, but ye that did cleave unto the Lord your power are alive, every one of you this day. So cleaving is synonymous, all right, with living. So it says clinging, adhering to, adhering to the word. It says to stick closer, all right, joining, all right. It says adhering. All right, let's read this in the NLT. And it says, but all of you who are faithful to the Lord, your power, are still alive today, every one of you. So again, cleaving is synonymous, all right, with living. So it says, but ye that did cleave unto the Lord, your power, are alive, every one of you this day. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my power commanded me, that ye should do so in the land whither ye go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So ultimately, by cleaving unto the Lord, we essentially we're prolonging our lives, all right, through the Spirit. All right, so going back, Bonsarat 2 and we're at verse 3, it says, cleave unto him and depart not away. By cleaving unto the Lord, we are prolonging our life. All right, we're in the mindset of life. All right, because the ways that we ultimately see the flesh, the ways that we came up in the world ultimately adhere to the flesh. All right, and going down from verse 3 to from verse 2 to verse 3, the flesh, ultimately, wants to make haste, all right, and get up out of those different situations irrationally. All right, the flesh ultimately wants to do what it wants to do. All right, it wants to depart away, you see, but the scriptures tell us, to cleave unto the Lord, you see, because that's ultimately how we're going to, that's ultimately how we're going to live. All right. It says, cleave unto him and depart not away that thou mayest be increased at thy last end. It says, whatsoever is brought upon thee, take cheerfully and be patient when thou art changed to a low estate. So ultimately, we should be taking the different trials and tribulations with the mindset of, all right, this is meant, to grow us. That's why it says, whatsoever is brought upon thee, take cheerfully, because these different obstacles and trials is meant to take us to the next level. It says, and be patient when thou art changed to a lower state. The word patient means to suffer. When we ultimately, going back to verse 1, it says, my son, if thou come to serve the Lord, prepare thy soul for temptation. So that word for patient goes into long suffering, because in this truth we've been called to suffer. So again, the Lord takes us through different obstacles and ultimately, to get us to where he wants us to be at. It says, and be patient when thou art changed to a lower state. It says, for gold is tried in the fire, and acceptable men in the furnace of adversity, because the scriptures says that, the Lord speaks through similitudes. All right. So it says, for gold is tried in the fire. All right. So gold, is put to the test by the goldsmith by putting it through that fire, because when that goldsmith wants to see if it's a good piece of metal, he'll see his reflection in it, So it says, for gold is tried in the fire, and acceptable men in the furnace of adversity. So that gold tried in the fire is likened unto, or acceptable men is likened, or excuse me, acceptable men in the furnace of adversity is likened unto gold tried in the fire. You see, because that fire in this instance, all right, it is that fire is the different obstacles that those acceptable men are going through. All right, and the ones that's supposed to make it out on the other side is going to be the elect. All right, so I'm gonna get another one, and that'll be it. Za'ayawab. This is Job chapter 23, and we'll get verse 10. And it says, I start from verse 9, and it says, on the left hand, I start from verse, let me see. I start from verse 8. It says, behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward. Well, verse 7. Well, I started like, let me see, verse 5. This is Job 23 and 5. It says, I would know the words which he would answer me, and understand what he would say unto me. Will he plead against me with his great power? No, but he would put strength in me. There the righteous might dispute with him. So should I be delivered forever from my judge. It says, behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand where he doeth work, but I cannot behold him. He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him. But he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. Job is a part of the elect. All right. And ultimately, each member of the elect is going to be tried as that gold in that fire, as we got in Bonserrat, the second chapter. All right, I'm going to get this word for tried, and it says bachan, and it says examine, to try, to prove. It says to scrutinize. It says to test, to prove, to try of gold. It says persons. It says the heart. It says the heart, man of the Most High. So the Lord is ultimately, testing our mental. The Lord is concerned with, our mental, because the outward man, that don't necessarily matter. All right, the Lord is concerned, with, how we're thinking, are we putting forth our best foot? All right, so it says, Bachan, it says to test, especially metals. It says generally and figuratively to investigate, to examine, And it was a quote one time, or pretty much not a quote. It was they were doing some like comparisons as to the top athletes, like in, it might have been college, or either college or it was some type of professional sports. But they said what divided the the top the top five from, or the top 5% from the top 20%, and which the top 20%, they were very talented, but the top 5% was divided. They were set apart. They were set apart, you see, and what set them apart was their mental, and pretty much, that sparked in my spirit, you see, because ultimately the Lord is concerned with the mental, as the elect is going through, the different said obstacles, the elect, You know, of course, you know, the elect is going to, the elect is still in the flesh, you see, but ultimately, in the end, the spirit is going to override the flesh, you know. So the elect would have thoughts of, you know, if they're going through different things, you know, they're going to cleave unto the Lord, going back to Bon Sirach, the second chapter, you know, cleave unto him and depart not away, so that thou mayest be increased at thy last end, roughly paraphrasing, you know, because the elect is going to have those positive thoughts, all right, using the using words to their advantage, all right, in which the ultimate word is these scriptures, you know. So the elect is ultimately going to use their greatest asset, all right, which is the faith, all right, ultimately, you know, to push forth, all right, through those different those said obstacles, you see, because the flesh, a carnal man, you know, will go through something, be like, man, fuck this shit, you know, but the elect is ultimately going to be blessed with that faith, all right, to ultimately push forth through the test. All right. So continuing on, Ayawab Job 23 and verse 10, it says, but he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. All right, and which gold, you know, that gold, all right, the good pieces of gold, you know, the ones that make it, all right, is gonna be, you know, gonna be brilliant. It's gonna be splendorous. All right. It says meaning to shimmer. It says fair. All right, skip down. Excuse me. All right, and it says, of the purest oil, brilliant like gold. It says metaphorically of the golden splendor of the heavens, perhaps of the sun itself, you know. So when we're reading this, you know, it sounds, these words are essentially going to heavy vibrations, you know. So ultimately, you know, those that, you know, make it to, you know, the precious pieces of metal, all right, those that are ultimately shimmering, the elect is ultimately going to shimmer in the spirit. All right, the elect ultimately is going to be those precious pieces of metal, all right, and worth every bit of the weight, you know, just in the spirit, you know. So it says Job Ayawab 23 and 10, it says, but he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. You know, each member of the elect is going to come forth as that gold, you know, because it's going to be some that, you know, go through the fire, you know, but they, you know, for whatever reason, you know, they're going to depart. All right, and they're going to be likened unto that dross and those refuse pieces of metal that's not worth for the test. All right, verse 11, it says, my foot hath held his steps. His way have I kept and not declined. Going back to Sirach 2 and verse 3, it says, cleave unto him and depart not away, that thou mayest be increased at thy last end. And we got, you know, how we ultimately cleave. We cleave unto the word. It says, my foot hath held his steps. His way have I kept and not declined. You know, we have to keep the word, regardless of whatever we're going through. It says, it says, neither have I gone back from the commandment of his lips. I have esteemed the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. And ultimately, you know, the scriptures is all that we need, you know, because this is what this is the stronghold. Essentially, you know, we're putting all our chips in our faith into the scriptures, you know, because that's all that we ultimately need, you know, which these carnal bodies do need food, you see, but ultimately the scriptures, it weighs more than actual food that these terrestrial bodies need, you see. But just wanted to go into that, you see, because ultimately, you know, the Lord is trying the elect, and the elect ultimately is going to come forth as those precious pieces of metal and that gold. All right, so I don't want to Zaza by night Apollos. That was a beautiful edification through the spirit. While I don't want to Zaza Atam Yashlay Lata Wab as well. You have a good night. Wash Shalom Lakam, which is peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.